You know what it is? I love it.
What I would like to begin with on this retreat and to expand today in the at least the initial coming days is the whole question of our moral experience of good and evil, approaching this in a very practical way. There's nothing more determinative than our thoughts and our feelings as to our experience of life's quality, as well as the quantity of life that we're able to receive and share in any given day. Classic Catholic theology has varying philosophical foundations. One can be seen in a line from Plato through Augustine and Bonaventure that will see the heart, the human will, as being primary. Of course, Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas will see the mind, the intellect, as being primary and, as it were, informing the will. Whatever comes first, middle, and last, suffice it to say that our thoughts and our feelings, and I use that word on purpose, the movements of our heart, our emotions, they are a moral womb in which grace blossoms, is conceived, and born into a moral goodness of good acts. Our thoughts and feelings are also a womb where temptation and evil beget sin, whether that's evil coming from the evil one or from the moral consequences of our past and present sins, or consequences of evil that is done to us by other people in the past or in the present. In the first chapter of Mark's Gospel, there's a very vivid scene. They came to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught. People were astonished at his teaching, for he taught as one having authority and not as the scribes. Now, there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. It's interesting to note, not a man who was an unclean spirit, but one who had an unclean spirit. Notice we say, I have the flu, I have a cold, I have cancer, not I am. So we have a man in an unclean spirit. And he cries out, what have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? And we note the plural, us. I know who you are. We get the first person singular, the Holy One of God. Then Jesus rebuked him and said, be quiet, come out of him. Then the scene stays loud. The unclean spirit convulses the man, and with a loud cry, literally it's a cognate accusative, crying a cry, he comes out of him. All were amazed and said, what is this, a new teaching? With authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. His fame spread everywhere throughout the whole region of Galilee. What do unclean spirits have to do with us? One of the arenas for your thoughts and reflection on this retreat, as I indicated in an email to Clark, and when later we have discussions, particularly Sunday night, is that the new Holy Father has some very frequent themes, one of them being the poor, but another is his great personal devotion to Mary, the Mother of God, but also the frequency with which he speaks about the devil. And I don't know if you're following his morning homilies. Some other Jesuits have done some, you can find on the internet, some syntheses of the various comments that he will make on the work of the evil one. I don't intend to discuss New Testament demonology here, except to say that we shouldn't be dismissive and just say, oh well, and turn the page. And in order to understand the role of the evil one, we want to always turn to Scripture, but also to look at the ascetical and patristic tradition. Just on a practical level, have you ever woken up in the morning or woken up from a nap and you're angry? You might say, well, that you have a spirit of anger. Or have you ever woken up and everybody else is fine, but nothing that you can do seems quite right to you? Or you're slothful, or you're lustful, or you're anxious and you don't know why. Now, the early Christian ascetics, particularly the monks, studied just the ordinary operations of the human person, especially our responses to temptation and our responses to grace. A series of writers vary on a template that can be found in the first chapter of the letter of James, where we read, "Blessed is the man who perseveres in temptation. For when he has been proved, he will receive the crown of life that he promised to those who love him. No one experiencing temptations should say, 'I am being tempted by God.' For God is not subject to temptation to evil, and he himself tempts no one. Rather, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire." Now, the Greek, there's epithumia. This is your thumos. It's not the nous, the mind, and it's not the cardia, it's not the heart, but it goes all the way back to Homer. It's a concept. We might say it's not technically your thorax, part of your body, but epithumia means upon the thumos. It generally has a pejorative meaning in the New Testament, that it's a passion. However, in the Lucan narrative, Jesus says, with a great epithumia, I have epithumiaed to eat this meal with you. So it's not always a negative thing. But this word desire or passion, desire conceives and brings forth sin. So you have this image of a conception and then a birth. And when sin reaches maturity, grows up, we're going to come to this image again later, just a few minutes, it gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. All good giving and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no alteration or shadow by change. And of course, change has to do with passion and desire and temptation. Please note the great emphasis on gift. Here we're in the letter of James. Faith without works is dead, but we see here also the great affirmation of the primacy of God's grace for our cooperation in the works. Something I think is very important is that God is never the author nor the cooperator with evil. Now, we want to remember Luke chapter 4, verse 13. At the very end of the Lucan narrative of Jesus' temptation, when the devil had finished every temptation, he departed for him for a time. Generally, there is a critical moment in when we are tempted. And it is not common in the Desert Fathers, but it is found here and there the notion that when in your life of faith and in your ministry you encounter personal temptations, the Desert Fathers and the elders would frequently say that's because there's something worth fighting. There's some important work that you're about to do. So the devil wants us to distract us or make us fall and have us lose our confidence and become self-focused rather than on doing the good for the kingdom that God intends. So there's a thought present in the human mind that gives birth to a desire or a passion. Now notice here in the Desert Fathers, although they're frequently very Platonic, you have this notion of, it's called a logismos. So it comes into the mind, but it affects the heart right away. Various fathers examine, particularly Evagrius Ponticus and John Cassian, where does the evil come from? Does it come from my own past sin, or the evil inclinations of my heart, or does it come from the devil? Monks get very, very practical, and they say it really doesn't matter. They're more interested in the praxis. We are like Cain, and I'd like to suggest that Cain is our middle name. In the course of the time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground, while Abel, for his part, brought from the firstlings of the flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he didn't look with favor. And we have a question there why. We don't know. This is like St. Paul writing in Romans, I love Jacob and I hated Esau. You just have to deal with it. Jacob was a deceiver and not a nice person. You know? Esau is, just from what we know from the stories, an ordinary person. So the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering did not look with favor. Cain was very angry and dejected, and the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why are you dejected? If you act rightly, you will be accepted. But if not, sin lies in wait at the door. Its urge is for you, yet you can rule over it. I think it's something that's very important here, is that sin and evil is personified. And this is a very important, very basic teaching of truth that the Church holds, and our Holy Father is frequently referencing and referring to the devil and the demons. So sin, it lies in wait at the door. At the same time, we're familiar with the very vivid scene from the letter of Revelations that Christ stands knocking at the door. So as we begin the retreat, I want to suggest to you that we have portals of our minds and portals of our hearts. So there are doors to our minds and our hearts. And a basic assumption that I'm going to use is the fact that we human beings become what we eat. Very literally, 3 hours later, or 3 days, or 3 months later, we become what we eat. That's why it's such an important affirmation in Lumen Gentium, quoting Pope St. Leo the Great, the partaking of the body and blood of Christ does nothing other than transform us into what we consume. So we become what we eat and drink physiologically, but also spiritually and sacramentally. At the same time, we become what we look at. So this has great consequence for Eucharistic adoration. It has great consequence for the whole practice of sacred images in the church, both in East and West, whether that's sacred art. We become what we look at. So, and this is very critical in our current culture in the United States that is extremely pornographic in its attitude, but also just metrically in the number of pornographic websites and in the economic activity. So we become what we listen to as well. So I think that's something that's crucial just in the basic content of our culture. And I'm not trying to be a Luddite. It's not the media in question. It's the content. Some young monks will think, well, these television shows are harmless. They're not graphic. But the presupposition of it all is contrary, is in every detail contrary to the new evangelization. So, however, I think we want to think of the adage, garbage in, garbage out. But you want to think of your mind and heart also spatially. One of a profound pastoral reality that I've run into in decades of priesthood is people who are in various very fine 12-step programs. They may be in inpatient or outpatient treatment. So if we just take a classic idea of some married man is in the 1950s, and he has a bunch of kids, and he works in a factory, and he gets off work and drinks beer from 5 o'clock until he passes out, at 10, and gets up and goes to work, but this all takes the toll, and there's an intervention, and he gets treatment, and he follows treatment, and there's the professionals, they'll give some exit strategy, some plan of all of these things he's supposed to do. But one of the things I've listened over and over again is, well, Father, this is what I'm doing, and I'm going to 90 meetings in 90 days, and I'm doing this and that. But frequently what's missing is just the very practical idea of, well, what are you going to do between 5 p.m. and 10 p.m.? You're going to go to an AA meeting at 8. There's all this other time, and I really do think that we, human beings, have the capacity and the opportunity to really live an examined life, but also to manage our minds and hearts well, where we decide what it is we're going to think about, and we also, we will also look at this. We decide how we're going to feel. I'm going to get to in a few moments is we have the mind of Christ. The question is, do we? And what does that mean? in a moment I'll give you the citation. Since you're all Catholics, you won't know where it is. You're supposed to laugh, thank you. We have the capacity to take every thought captive to Christ. What would Jesus do? Sometimes we think that's trite, but I really don't think it is. So what would Jesus watch? What would Jesus listen to? What would Jesus think? Because you see, our doing and our being come from thoughts and feelings, emotions, movements of the heart. Now, when I was the age of most of you, there was a lot of horse doo-doo in the man on the street nature, popular psychology, psycho-theobabble that would say, well, feelings are neutral as long as you don't act on them. So you can be filled with rage or lust, and it doesn't matter if you don't act out on it. Well, Jesus is explicitly, speaks to the contrary. But again, I want to talk about the self-interest that I started with. There's nothing that more affects our quality of life and our quantity of life than our thoughts and our feelings. And we choose what we think, and we choose also how we feel to a greater or less extent in both of those categories. Now, the movements of our heart and mind that are unclean are varied. We can be gluttonous when we're not hungry. We can be impure sexually in thought and word and deed. And what I'm giving you here are the classic 8 deadly sins of the monastic desert, long before you get the 7 capital sins, which is more scholastic and Middle Age and current events. The monks went to the desert, and they wanted to strip away all sorts of distraction, and so they wanted to conquer vice and cultivate virtue. And no, they were not Pelagian, although some of them get called semi-Pelagian, but they're really not. The image that was used is the human person is freed from Egypt, the slavery of Egypt. So I think for us, this is baptism, but it's also the sacrament of reconciliation. So we're walking dry shod through the sea. And we're stepping over the bodies of these dead Egyptian soldiers that have been drowned. So the story of the Exodus, the Passover, that we relive, this is who we really are, and this is our story. But also, there is the conquest of the land. Why are there 8 deadly sins? Because there were 8 tribes that had to be defeated and supplanted. See, the Bible was their mirror of the individual and communal spiritual life. The Hivites, Jebusites, etc. So, but from observation of themselves, to be sexually totally continent, they would fast. So they saw that gluttony was linked with porneia is the Greek word. So for any sexual immorality, those two things, they go together. Then the next two are avarice, which is in Greek very vivid. It's having moreness. I really like this. It's just having moreness. State of having more. Now, what do you think happens when you give in to avarice? The result is going to be logically anger. Then I think very telling for us moderns, and I do believe it's not going to be until the rise of the social sciences in the late 19th century, which, like philosophy, they can be handmaidens of the church and of theology. We have to be careful that we distinguish the limits of the social sciences, but I think that it was only until Freud that human understanding of the mechanics of the human psychology, of anthropology, were matched. I don't really think that modern psychology has actually surpassed the Desert Fathers. But at any rate, the next sin was not caring, acedia. In the Latinized form, it's accidia. They described it as the noonday devil, one of the Compline Psalms. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the scourge that lays waste at noon. So it's when you have the accidia is, well, this place, you know what. If I weren't in this program, I could be across town and really doing something good. I don't need to live with these volunteers. This is inefficient. If I had my own apartment and my own checking account and all that, I could do so much more efficiently. So it's always it's almost existential. There's this ennui. There is this boredom. You can't really get enthused with anything, and it will give birth to tristitia, which is sadness. And if you read this early Christian ascetic literature, it's clinical depression almost. So these are these evils, and please note that there is this progression. So there is this cooperation with evil. You have gluttony and porneia. Then you have avarice that's thwarted and one is angry at others. Then there is this listlessness, not really caring, that will give birth to this profound sadness, not compunction. Remember, St. Paul says there's a sadness unto death and there's a sadness unto repentance. This is the worldly grief of a depressed sadness. And then next is empty show, empty glory. Kenodoxia. The reason why the words are frequently used in Greek, even when they're not written, even when the authors say, like John Cassian writes in Latin, is that it's coming from a lot of the early ascetic literature will come either from the Gospels or from the Pauline and the Catholic letters. And of course, then the ultimate, the eighth sin that flows out of empty show, empty glory, is pride. So all of these passions, they start with a thought, there's a passion. If it is not stopped, and we're going to talk about stopping them at the door in a moment, they will give birth to a sin. And the sin will beget death. Now, when I was young, I drove a stretch of highway about twice a year. And some farmer had this big, humongous billboard that says, "The wages of sin is death." And every time I saw it, I used to think, lighten up, get a different message. you know. But then when I got into my 40s and 50s, every time I see that billboard, I think, yes, and the human person gets the paycheck right away. There's a consequence of human evil. Being a priest, I hear a lot of confessions, do a lot of pastoral work. There are a couple versions of the traditional act of contrition. Oh my God, I'm heartily sorry for having offended thee, and I detest all my sins because I dread the loss of heaven and the pains of hell. This loss of heaven can be experienced immediately. I mean, it can be eschatological and ultimate, and that's a reality. But spiritually, we can, even with the venial sin, we experience this paycheck, this reward, this result of evil. So remember, thought, passion, sin, then a death in some way. A common image that is used comes from Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat weeping when we remembered Zion. Now, later we will refer to fleeing Babylon. We're going to talk about situational evil. We're going to allude to the experience of Lot in Sodom, where the angels pull him into the door. It's very interesting, this door. And then Lot and his family, they flee from this. Babylon, likewise, could be the injunction to flee that culture and touch nothing unclean, and go. And this is something that we must do, and Christians have done throughout the millennia, is that this is, we leave Egypt. We enter and take possession of the promised land, conquering vices, killing them. And a vice is nothing other than a repeated sin, habitual. So, and a virtue, it is a non-inclusive, gender discriminatory word, because it comes from the word for man. So virtue, sorry, it's not intentional, it's a joke. Thank you for smiling. Okay, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat remembering Zion. So when we're in the exile of Babylon, away from Zion, on the poplars in its midst we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for the words of a song, our tormentors for joy, sing for us a song of Zion. How could we sing a song of the Lord in a foreign land? Please think of that morally. You know, again, with counseling people on how to make a radical change in their life. Someone who's just gotten out of treatment for alcoholism shouldn't go sit with his friends in the bar. If you sit in a barber shop long enough, you're going to get a haircut. You know, people that have pornographic problems, they need to put their computer in the dining room table with their grandmother or their spouse or, you know, other people. You just structure for success. So you can't sing a song of the Lord in Zion. Frequently, I don't watch TV, and I won't go off on my little rabbit trail, anti-TV, but I frequently, as a priest, hear people say, well, Father, there's a show I knew I shouldn't watch. So I just think this is, is very, very, very telling for us that we flee Babylon, we walk out of Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, if I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand wither, may my tongue stick to my palate if I don't remember you and exalt. Notice forget and remember. This is all what we're talking about, guarding the mind, managing the mind, where you do not forget. St. Benedict in his rule has a lot of little maxims all together, and they're called the tools of good works. And one of them is flee, like you flee Babylon, you flee Egypt, is flee oblivionem. So oblivio is being oblivious. So the opposite of being oblivious is to remember, to not forget. If I do not exalt Jerusalem beyond all my delights, and of course for us, Jerusalem is going to be the church in all of the levels of her manifestation. So later, in case I forget, I'll say it now, you have this sentire cum ecclesia, thinking with the church, is a classic phrase. To think with the church, or to think church. So as you look out, you think church. We look at other people, we see Christ. So remember, Lord, against Edom, that day of Jerusalem, they said, tear it down to its foundation. Daughters of Babylon, you will be destroyed. Happy is the one who repays you the ills you paid on us. And one of the things I just want to mention, this is incensive prayer. This is, you're adjuring Jerusalem. This is, in a sense, we in the West don't pray this way unless we really pray the Psalms, where we're telling evil to get lost. We're praying against evil. Happy is the one who repays you the ills you brought on us. And here comes the verse, which is the reason why we're doing this whole psalm, is, blessed is the one who dashes your babies on the rock. So it's a very, very vivid image. Now, why does the church pray this? Do you know, right, in the Roman breviary right now, a lot of these, they're excised. It was the Holy Father Paul VI decided in the breviary to do that. And so in the Roman office, they're not. But monks are very, very good at we pray all the cursing psalms and all of these verses. But this became a very, very important a word. And you look right now in the geopolitics of the world, there are a lot of Islamic babies that are little boys that will be raised thinking that we are the great Satan. And may I say, even on videotape, the Quran and the Bible would agree. If you look at the content of our culture, our entertainment, our music, I think I just read recently on a blog called I think it was Courageous Priest. It might have been it's Badger Catholic. It's 3 Catholic laymen in Wisconsin, where one of the bishops of Wisconsin gave a presentation on Humanae Vitae and gave the 4 consequences of artificial contraception that Paul VI envisioned. And one of the third from the 4th, it would be the intrusion of civil authority, as we're seeing right now. But it would be the degradation of women, that men would see them just as objects, and there would be moral laxity of sex without consequences. So it was, this bishop in Wisconsin just pointed out that this teaching was very prophetic. So, for the early monks, an evil thought or an evil feeling is a baby, and if you don't smash it on the rock, it'll grow up to be a soldier and kill you. So, in the rule of Saint Benedict, he's in the patristic era, he says this: let us gird our loins with faith and the performance of good work, and following the gospel as our guide, walk in his path. Notice there's this notion of journey. The whole rule of Benedict, and this is in the opening verses, says, listen, my son, to the precepts of your master, and incline the ear of your heart, that you may willingly accept and faithfully fulfill the admonition of a father who loves you, that you may by obedience return to him from whom you have departed by disobedience. So there is this relationship between the Father and that we are in return. So we must get up at long last and gird our loins with faith and the performance of good works. This is very, very interesting because this is right after the whole Pelagian controversy. Faith and good works. And this idea of girding your loins is that you have to, if you're going to move on this road, you can't have your long garments. So you're holding them. And if we wish to dwell in the tabernacle of his kingdom, except we run there with good deeds, we shall not arrive. But let us ask the Lord with the prophet, who shall dwell in your tents and rest on your holy mountain? Then let us hear the Lord answering and showing us the road to that tabernacle, he that walks without blame and does what is right, speaking the truth in his heart, and who speaks no deceit on his tongue, nor has done evil to his neighbor, nor thought evil of his neighbor. Tomorrow and the next day we're going to talk about where you move from the heart and the mind to the mouth. But it's very interesting. I just wanted to point out just how practical this all is. It has to do with praxis. Such men as these, fearing the Lord, are not puffed up. They magnify the Lord and say that all of this comes from God, not to us, but to the Lord. So, he that takes the evil spirit that tempts him and casts him, the evil spirit, and the temptation from the sight of his heart. So you take the evil spirit that comes to you and the temptation itself from the sight of your heart, your desiring, and you dash both of them to pieces on the rock that is Christ. Isn't that special? So it's in the monastic tradition. So when you're tempted, you take the temptation and you dash it on the rock that's Christ. Now, Saint Benedict here, as the fathers of the church do all the time, they think biblically, they preach biblically. He's mixing metaphors and he's mixing biblical passages. That's Psalm. But here's what else he's thinking about. 1 Corinthians 10. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all of them were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from a spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. So, this is what Benedict's thinking of this verse as well. You dash the demon and the temptation itself on the rock that's Christ. So he's mixing those two things. Now, it's very interesting just to point out, St. Paul is wrong, because if you read through those narratives, the rock didn't actually follow them. You know, the cloud follows them, but at any rate, there's a profound theological truth. It's not literal. It's so Paul is right, but Paul himself is mixing a metaphor, because Jesus is the rock. I mean, Jesus is the fountain of life. And remember, how did they get water from the rock? Moses took the staff and struck it. And what was the problem when he struck it?
Water didn't come out immediately.
And he didn't believe, and he struck it a second time. Tomorrow we're going to talk about murmuring, and the consequence of murmuring. Saw how only 2 people got to enter the promised land. The little kids did, because they didn't murmur against God. But Moses wasn't allowed to go in because he doubted the fact that he struck it a second time. So St. Benedict is thinking about this. Okay, we do not, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, we don't have a wisdom that's of this age. What eye has not seen, what ear has not heard, what has not entered into the human heart, God has prepared for those who love him. We have known, who has known the mind of the Lord so as to counsel him? He's quoting the Old Testament. He says, but we have the mind of Christ. So, in all sorts, and we want to keep this in mind in the coming days, what would Jesus think? What does Jesus think about this person with whom I'm speaking, or this situation, or this course of action that I'm contemplating? St. Paul will also in 2 Corinthians talk about the way that he argues. He said, for although we are in the flesh, we don't battle according to the flesh. Our weapons are not of the flesh. We destroy arguments and every pretension raising itself against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive in obedience to Christ. So it's like a prisoner of war. I think this is very great. We take every thought captive to Christ. So as a prisoner of war. Please note, too, that when you throw something against a rock, I like to think of this as some sort of a litmus test. So you have a touchstone, which has some chemical quality. Again, I'm mixing metaphors, but the fathers of the church did it all the time. So if a thought comes to you, and you throw it against the rock that's Christ, and it bounces right back at you, then it's okay. But if it smashes on Christ, that's that. Something about, and I'm not going to go on at great length, but we are composed of feelings, and I'm not really huge on feelings. When I was your age, there was a song, Feelings, but think of our emotions and think of how visceral they are. Now, in Philippians, the 8th verse of the 1st chapter, for God is my witness how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus. This word affection in Greek is intestines. In the Latin, it's in viseribus. In the Douay Rheims, which is the classic Catholic translation of the Vulgate, for God is my witness how I long after you all in the bowels of Jesus Christ. So you see, the seat of emotions, but this is also of pity, and please, we have to remember too that a lot of these texts are used to describe the mercy of God, the pity. So Jesus will be moved to pity. So it really says he was, doesn't say his bowels were in an uproar. That's generally when someone's angry. But he's viscerally moved. So they saw the seat, particularly being moved to pity, or sometimes the English it's translated moved to compassion. What I'd like to suggest for your meditation is being conformed to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which is to take your emotions and feelings, the likes and dislikes, and let them. I believe that one of the great values of the Sacrament of Reconciliation is that, of course, our sins are forgiven thoroughly, but we receive grace, which sanctifies us, and also makes us right or righteous, just or justified. It is restoring that baptismal interest in innocence of that is a gift that's just walking through the Red Sea, out of Egypt. But more, that grace is actual and operative within us. We have the capacity to cooperate with it. And I think that all of the sacraments, and especially the sacrament of the Word of God that is really present, in which Christ is really present when it's proclaimed in the sacred assembly, but which purifies us. In the fourth gospel, in the Last Supper narrative before Jesus dies, he talks about people being cleansed. If you don't bear fruit, you're cut off, kathairo. But if you do bear fruit, you're cleansed, you're pruned, which is a pun, because that's katharos, which means pure, you're purified, you're cleansed. And then, he and Peter have this little argument about the washing of the feet. And he said, but if you have already been cleansed, you don't need to wash again, except only your feet. He said, but not all, referring, of course, to Judas. But then in that same discourse, where there's a lot of focus on this cleansing, he said, you are already cleansed by the word I have spoken to you. So I think, and I know, and there's the whole tradition behind, is that someone who's an alcoholic that gets out of treatment and he drank every night of his life from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., the AA meeting from 8 to 9 isn't going to do it. It's to have these various backup activities to do between 5 and 10 p.m. at night. And of course, you would immediately, counsel someone like that and say, well, have backup plans. Don't go work out at the gym, because if the power goes off and the gym is closed, what are you going to do then? We see in our moral lives, that's the way we want to operate. We want to be very good managers, so we don't and it's important that we own the fact we don't have to sin. So it isn't just it isn't something that just happens. There is this whole science. Okay, so with the sacramental life of the church, but also our daily encounters with Christ in community and in liturgical prayer, but also in Eucharistic adoration, that grace is transforming us. And I like to think of our thoughts are taken captive to Christ. Christ is the touchstone of our thoughts, but also we have the mind of Christ. And we have the same feelings about stuff and about people as Christ did. Just this morning, the Holy Father talked about a number of things. He was talking about baptism, and he recalled the words of Pope Paul VI. It's absurd to claim that we love Christ without the church, that we listen to Christ but not the church, that we're with Christ but on the margins of the church. The gospel message, Pope Francis said, comes to us through the church, and our path to holiness must be found within the church. Speaking of the three pillars which undermine our sense of belonging to the church, the Pope said the first is humility and the realization that the story of salvation does not start or end with us. This is how he can be very refreshing, something that's very obvious. One of the things this apostolic exhortation that he's come out with, I recommend that you read it multiple times. Right now we monks are reading it in the refectory. It's being read aloud to us as we eat. We always have table reading. Not always, but there are things that very intelligent and very holy and trained people are catching in this, with this public reading of it. That struck me. Remember, the Bible was, it is really, it's in the church that it's created. It's also in the church where it's proclaimed and preached. Dei Verbum will address this reality that it is a communal document, always with ethical and communal and liturgical consequences. But he goes on to say, instead, humility helps us. A person who is not humble, he said, cannot feel with the church. And I just love this. Now, I didn't go look at what the Italian was, but to feel, sentire cum ecclesia, is to think with the church. But I'm wondering what word he used, and this was we preached in Italian. To feel with the church. To think with the church, to feel with the church. Instead, humility helps us understand, but only feels what he or she desires. So I really like that idea. So here you almost have this discernment of feelings. You can have a discernment of spirits, discernment of thoughts, discernment of feelings. Am I feeling with Christ? Am I feeling with the church? The second pillar, Pope Francis said, is faithfulness to the teaching and doctrine of the church. One of the most beautiful things he said in one of his famous unprepared interviews was he said, well, I am a son of the church. And this was on the flight back from Rio. It's like I hope you people understand that, you know. I don't know whether it was what was the question, whether it was the ordination of women or whatever, but he just said, you know, I'm a son of the church, which is something that's, I think, very, very important, that, you know, we are born of the church, and we belong to the church in that way. Thirdly, the Pope said we must remember to pray with and for the church in all parts of the world. Do we really pray for the church? He asked, not just at daily Mass, but also when we are at home. May the Lord help us to follow this path, to deepen our sense of belonging and feeling with the church. Francis de Sales once said that the frontier between the kingdom of good and evil passes right through my soul. And I really like this truth. So we can think of our soul, our mind and heart, as territory that's divided. You have North Korea, South Korea. Have you ever seen pictures of demilitarized zones? And in Korea, it's I think it's something in their culture. You have both sides and they're just watching each other and neither side is blinking. It's just like 24/7. It's kind of, it isn't funny, but it is so ludicrous, it's funny. So that's a little different image than the mind and the heart being. Here it is a place of battle. It's a place of different territory. However, I think, and I was just throwing that out, so let me just cite some scriptural passages and then we'll have some discussion. The New Testament and early Christian ascetic literature will speak of sobriety and vigilance. Sobriety, the word that's used is napsis, and it means to abstain from wine, to be sober, but it also means to be circumspect, which comes from the Latin, means you're looking around, means you're vigilant, means you're aware. And think of all of those texts that we hear in Advent, like do not let your hearts sink down in drunkenness or dissipation. And frankly, and we're going tomorrow talk about R.V. Wade and Herod and the Magi and how we fit in all of that scene. But we can learn from Magi. We can learn, and this when we talk about the mouth, I just will challenge you to reflect on all that the Holy Father says about listening in terms of it, when we're engaging with the culture, of how we're silent and listening to them and accepting that there's some truth in them, that we're not just hitting them over the head with the truth that we have as a precious gift that we freely received, and that we must share that with other people. But the Eastern religions, you hear about mindfulness. Well, the early Christian ascetic literature is full of this notion of sobriety. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 6, so then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake, and that means vigilant. And the word Gregory comes from that. It's a watchman. It comes from the perfect of the verb. It's I have arisen, so I have arisen up. So I'm keeping awake, I'm keeping vigil, and I am being sober. 1 Thessalonians 5:8, since we belong to the day, let us be sober. And you see, he's not talking here about not drinking. He's talking about mental sobriety, vigilance. Put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, hope of salvation. Okay. 1 Timothy 4:5, as for you, always be steady. That's the RSV translation. It's be sober in all things. So that's 1 2 Timothy 4, verse 5. Endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. Notice this, he's talking about the new evangelization. That was the first time it was new. He's talking about fulfilling your diaconia. So that's getting things done. And he's talking about enduring the sufferings that go along with all that. But the first thing he says is be vigilant. So be sober. 1 Peter 4, 7. This is quite beautiful. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore be serious and sober for prayers. And there it's same verb. Then there's the famous one that for centuries was the Compline prayer. And now this is on Tuesday nights in the Roman office, and it's on First Vespers, I believe, in the Roman office on feast and Sunday. Be sober, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion. No, it's at second Compline after second Vespers. Be sober, be watchful. So have this mental possession of mind and heart, and keep watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. But then the text goes on, and it's quite beautiful, and you might want to read that. It's in 1 Peter chapter 5. Know that the community of brothers throughout the world is enduring the same temptation. And here's a nice tie-in with what the Holy Father said this morning, is feel with the church. You know, St. Augustine once wrote about, well, why am we going to pray these psalms, and I don't, why, 1/3 of them are laments, but everything's going fine in my life. Well, somewhere in the world, a member of the body of Christ is afraid or angry or is persecuted. There's this. So this idea, this temptation, is we want to be sober and alert and resist temptation because everybody else is in the front line with us in other Christian communities all over the world. Okay, 2 Timothy 2, chapter 6. The verses before, he talks about don't get involved in foolish and ignorant debates that breed quarrels. Be gentle with everyone, able to teach, tolerance, correcting opponents with kindness. And the images, I think, of kindness are just of John Paul II and of Benedict XVI, with this extreme humility that's always listening to the other person. Even when it's horse doo-doo. Like Fidel Castro lecturing the Pope, who just stood there on the tarmac in Cuba and kind of just let him rant on. Okay, just a couple more. 1 Corinthians 15, come to your right mind and sin no more. So this is like, it's not sober up, it's sober out. Sober out and sin no more. For some have no knowledge of God. I say this to your shame. So we come to, we sober up to righteousness.